The afternoon sun was slanting through the high windows of the courthouse, casting long, dusty shadows across the worn wooden floors. It was a Tuesday, which usually meant the courtroom was packed with a chaotic mix of lawyers, police officers, and families waiting for their turn to face the judge. The air smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the faint, metallic scent of anxiety that always seems to hang around rooms where people's fates are being decided. The judge sitting on the bench was a man who had seen it all. He was older, with silver hair and deep lines etched into his face that seemed to get deeper every time he sighed. He had been wearing the black robe for what felt like forever. He had heard thousands of cases. He had listened to every excuse in the book. The dog ate the homework. The car wouldn't start. The neighbor's dog made me do it. He was a good man, but he was tired. He was a realist. He knew that most days. He was just a cog in a machine that processed paperwork and handed out fines. He looked down at the list on his desk. It was a mile long. "Next case," he called out, his voice loud but lacking energy. The bailiff, a big man who looked like he could sleep standing up, nodded his head. "Calling the case of the state versus the minor, Grace." A young girl stood up from the back row. She looked small in the big empty space of the aisle. She was 17, dressed in a clean but slightly oversized blazer that made her look like she was playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. She didn't look like a hardened criminal. She looked like a student who was worried about missing her next class. As she walked toward the front, the judge leaned back in his chair. He glanced at the prosecutor, a young man in a cheap suit who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The prosecutor gave a small shrug, indicating this wasn't a big deal. It was a minor violation. Something about a protest or a gathering that got a little too loud. The prosecutor had already made a deal. If she admitted she did it, she would just do some community service and clean up trash on the weekend. It was the easy way out. It was the way things usually went. Grace reached the podium. It was made of dark, heavy wood and came up to her chest. She had to stand on her tiptoes just to see over the top of the microphone. She didn't have a lawyer with her. She was representing herself, which almost always made judges roll their eyes. The judge looked at her over his glasses. "Miss," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "we have a plea agreement here. You admit to the charge, you do some service hours, and you go home. It's a good deal. Saves everyone a lot of time." The girl shook her head. Her hair was pulled back tight in a ponytail, and her eyes were wide and serious. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked focused. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice was a little shaky at first, echoing in the quiet room. "I appreciate the offer, but I am not accepting the deal, because I didn't break the law. The law, as it is written, is actually illegal itself." A quiet laugh escaped the judge's throat. He couldn't help it. It was such a silly thing to say. He heard things like this maybe once a month. Usually it was from people who read a few things on the internet and suddenly thought they were constitutional experts. He saw it as a sign of youth, of inexperience. It was amusing, in a way. He smiled, leaning forward slightly, enjoying the moment of levity in a boring day. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice dripping with that kind, patronizing tone adults use with children who claim they can fly. "You think the city council, the lawyers, and the police are all enforcing a law that is illegal? And you figured this out all by yourself?" A few people in the gallery snickered. A couple of lawyers in the back row leaned in to whisper to each other. It's probably sharing a joke about the high school dropout, who thought she knew more than the people with law degrees. Grace didn't laugh. She didn't blush or look down at her shoes. She gripped the edges of the podium until her knuckles turned white. She pulled a stack of crumpled papers from her bag. They weren't in a nice folder. They were loose, held together by a rubber band that was ready to snap. They looked like homework assignments that had been stuffed into a backpack and forgotten. "Sir," Grace said. Her voice got stronger. "I know how it sounds. I know I look like a kid. But I have read the statute. I read the state constitution. And I read the case from 1984. The judge raised an eyebrow. He crossed his arms. "All right," he said. He thought he would humor her. It was a slow day, and maybe this would be entertaining. He looked at the clock. He had 5 minutes before his next scheduled break. "Go ahead. Tell me your argument, but keep it brief. We have a lot of people waiting." He signaled to the court reporter to start typing. The prosecutor sat back in his chair looking bored, checking his watch. The room was still, but it was a bored kind of still. Everyone was waiting for the girl to stutter, say something that didn't make sense so the judge could gently cut her off. Tell her to take the deal and move on to the next person. The tension in the room was low. It felt like a formality. Grace took a deep breath. She didn't look at her notes immediately. She looked the judge right in the eye. Article 4. Section 12 of the state constitution says that no public property can be used to endorse a specific political viewpoint, she started. The judge kept smiling, but his eyes narrowed just a fraction. He waited for the punchline. The citation I received, Grace continued, was for being in the public park after hours during a vigil. But the statute allows religious gatherings to stay in the park after hours. If you close the park to me, a private citizen, but keep it open for a religious group, the state is effectively endorsing that religion over my right to assembly. The judge opened his mouth to interrupt, ready to tell her that there were exceptions for public safety. But she held up a hand to stop him. It was a bold move. You didn't stop the judge when he was speaking. Your Honor, please, she said quickly. I know what you are going to say. You are going to say it is about the permit? But look at the permit application form. Section 4B requires a statement of faith for a religious waiver, but requires a proof of insurance for a political gathering. That is a content-based restriction. In the case of Roberts versus the city, the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot treat speech differently based on what is being said or who is saying it. The judge's smile froze. He blinked. He stopped looking at the clock. He looked down at his desk, where a copy of the city's municipal code was sitting. He had read it 1,000 times. He had enforced those permit rules himself, but he had never looked at them side by side like that. He had never compared the religious waiver to the political gathering requirement in the back of the room. The snickering stopped. One of the lawyers who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence and looked up. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and quietly tapped on the screen. Searching for the case name Grace had just mentioned, the prosecutor stopped checking his watch. He sat up straighter, his back coming off the chair. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, for the first time. She wasn't fumbling through her papers anymore. She was flipping through them with practiced ease. And furthermore, Grace said, her voice ringing out clearly now, filling every corner of the room, the city cannot tax me for speaking, but they are waiving the park fee for the church group. That is a subsidy of speech. That violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. I have the receipts right here from the city treasurer's office showing the fee waiver. She slapped a handful of paperwork onto the ledge of the witness stand. The judge stared at the papers. Then he looked back at the girl. The amused, patronizing feeling he had felt just moments ago was draining away, replaced by a cold, creeping sensation in his gut. He realized, with a sudden jolt of clarity, that this wasn't a joke. She wasn't reciting a TV show script. She had done the work. She had done the work that the lawyers should have done. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't bored anymore. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes that the ground beneath their feet is about to shift. The judge swallowed hard. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His full attention locked on the teenage girl standing in the oversized blazer. He wasn't laughing anymore. Proceed, the judge said softly. And for the first time all day, he wasn't the one in control. The girl didn't rush. She took a moment to smooth out the crinkled edges of her papers, the sound of the crinkling sheets loud in the quiet room. It was the only sound for a second, apart from the hum of the air conditioner. She wasn't looking at the audience or the prosecutor. Her eyes were fixed on the law book sitting on the judge's desk. She looked like she was gathering her thoughts, not out of fear, but out of precision. She wanted to get this exactly right. She looked up, adjusted the microphone one more time, and began to speak. She didn't start with an emotional story about her life or why she was at the park that night. She didn't try to make the judge feel sorry for her. Instead, she started talking about dates and numbers. On page 4 of the city's code, she said, her voice steady now, Section 12B clearly states that any assembly of more than 50 people requires a permit. That part is fine. But look at the exemption clause added in 1998. She picked up a specific sheet of paper, holding it up like a teacher showing a diagram to a class. The exemption allows for spontaneous religious celebrations to bypass the permit process entirely. No fee, no waiting period, no insurance requirement. However, spontaneous political gatherings are not listed. The judge leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were scanning the pages of the thick book in front of him. He was flipping through the pages, trying to find the exact section she was quoting. His fingers moved quickly across the thin paper. He found it. He read the words. Then he read them again. He looked back at the girl. She was already moving on to her next point. She didn't pause for applause. She didn't pause to see if he was impressed. She was like a machine that had been turned on and couldn't be stopped until it was finished. In 2002, she continued, the state Supreme Court ruled in the Henderson case that you cannot favor one type of speech over another. If the city says a religious group can gather whenever they want, but a political group has to ask for permission 30 days in advance, the city is picking a winner. The government isn't allowed to pick winners. The prosecutor in the cheap suit shifted in his chair. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to break the girl's rhythm. Your Honor, he interrupted, standing up. Objection. The defendant is misinterpreting the statute. The religious exemption is for traditional ceremonies, not public speech. It's a cultural thing. This is apples and oranges. The judge looked at the prosecutor. For a moment, the judge looked annoyed that the flow had been broken. He looked back at the girl, then down at the law book, and finally at the prosecutor. Sit down, the judge said to the prosecutor. It wasn't a polite request. The prosecutor looked surprised, his mouth hanging open slightly, but he sat down. He looked at the girl with a new kind of wariness. He looked at the crumpled papers in her hands. Wondering what else was in there, Grace didn't even acknowledge the interruption. She just kept going. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a thick folder. It was bound with one of those black plastic combs you get at a print shop. It looked heavy. I anticipated that argument, she said, her voice calm. She opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper across the polished wood of the judge's bench. This is a memo from the city clerk's office, dated last year. In it, they define a spontaneous religious celebration as any group gathering for the purpose of expressing shared beliefs. That definition is so broad, Your Honor, that it could cover a weekly book club. But a political rally about safety laws has to pay $200 and wait a month. The judge picked up the memo. He held it up to the light. He squinted at the official seal in the corner. It was real. It was definitely real. He rubbed his forehead with his free hand. He could feel a headache starting to form behind his eyes, but it wasn't from boredom. It was from the sudden, heavy weight of the situation. He realized with a sinking feeling that nobody in the city government was checking their work. They had been copying and pasting laws for decades, adding little bits here and there, without ever checking if the whole thing made sense. And here was this 17-year-old kid, pointing out that the emperor wasn't just wearing no clothes. The emperor's clothes didn't even match. The people in the gallery were completely silent now. The man who had been laughing earlier was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his mouth open. The bailiff, who usually looked like he was half asleep, was standing perfectly still by the door, his arms crossed. Watching the girl like she was a detective solving a murder mystery, Grace continued. She started talking about insurance. She explained that the city required political groups to have $1 million of liability insurance. It sounded like a lot, and it was. I called 5 insurance companies this morning, she said. Well, I called my uncle, who is an agent, and he called 5 companies. To get a one-day policy for a political rally costs $3,000, but the church groups get a waiver. So, if you have money, or if you are a church, you can speak. If you are a student with no money, you have to stay home. That turns the First Amendment into a luxury item. The judge looked up from the memo. He looked at the girl's clothes again, the blazer that was too big, the scuffed shoes. She wasn't speaking theoretically. She was talking about herself. She was saying that the law was designed to keep people like her people without money-quiet. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was respect. It was mixed with a bit of shame. He had been sitting on this bench for 30 years, enforcing these rules. And he had never once thought about the insurance cost for a teenager. He had never thought about how the rules looked to someone who didn't have a law degree or a pocket full of cash. "I have another case here," Grace said, flipping through her folder again. The case of State versus Reynolds from 2015. In that ruling, the court said that financial burdens on speech are just as bad as banning speech. You can't make it too expensive to talk. She took a breath. She looked around the courtroom for the first time. She saw the people listening. She saw the prosecutor taking notes furiously. She saw the judge rubbing his forehead. "The city charged me with trespassing," she said, her voice softening just a little, becoming more human. "They said I was in the park after hours, but the park was unlocked. The lights were on. And across the lake, a church group was singing. They had no permit. They were just singing, and nobody was arresting them." She looked back at the judge. Her eyes were bright. "I wasn't trespassing, Your Honor. I was just in the wrong category. I was in the category that doesn't get a free pass. And the Constitution says there shouldn't be categories like that." The judge let out a long, slow breath. He looked at the bailiff. He looked at the prosecutor. The prosecutor wasn't looking at his watch anymore. He was looking at his own copy of the statute, turning the pages frantically, looking for a loophole, looking for something to save his case. But his face was getting pale. He couldn't find anything. The judge looked at the girl. She was standing tall. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't the delinquent that had been written on the docket sheet 5 minutes ago. She was a lawyer. She was a better lawyer than half the people who practiced in his courtroom, Miss the judge said. His voice was different now. It was quiet. It was the voice you use when you were talking to someone who just taught you something you didn't know. "Are you telling me that the entire permitting ordinance for the city parks is unconstitutional?" Grace nodded. "Yes, sir. Not just part of it. The way they enforce it makes the whole thing invalid. If you enforce it against me, you have to enforce it against everyone. And since they won't enforce it against the churches, they can't enforce it against me." The judge sat back. He looked up at the ceiling, as if the answers were written in the plaster. He felt the weight of the gavel on the desk in front of him. It was a heavy piece of wood, dark and shiny. He realized that if he agreed with her, and the law was clear enough that he probably had to, it wasn't just letting one girl go free. He was tearing down a law that the city had used for 20 years. He looked around the room. He saw the serious faces. He saw the way people were nodding their heads, almost imperceptibly, as they thought about what she had said. The girl wasn't just fighting a ticket. She was fighting for fairness. And she was winning. "Keep going," the judge whispered. He didn't say it loudly, but the room heard it. He wanted to hear the rest. He needed to know what else she had found. He pushed his glasses up his nose and got ready to take notes, realizing that the history books might remember this day. And it wasn't going to be because of anything he did. It was going to be because of the girl in the oversized blazer. The air in the room felt heavy, like the weight of the air before a thunderstorm rolls in. The usual shuffling of feet, the coughing, and the rattling of papers had completely stopped. It was so quiet you could hear the buzzing of a fluorescent light strip above the judge's head. That buzzing sound seemed to get louder as the seconds ticked by, acting like a timer counting down to something explosive. Grace didn't let the silence intimidate her. She didn't look like a high school student anymore. She looked like a professor giving a lecture to a crowded hall. She reached into her stack of papers and pulled out a sheet that was yellowed with age. It looked fragile, like it might crumble if she held it too tight. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "I want to talk about 1984. Not the book, but the specific court ruling from this state's Supreme Court regarding public property usage." The judge watched her closely. He had stopped taking notes for a moment. His pen hovered over the yellow legal pad on his desk. He was thinking back to his law school days, trying to recall the case she was talking about. It wasn't a famous case. It wasn't one of those landmark decisions that every first-year student memorized. It was a dusty old ruling about property taxes and municipal parks. Grace placed the yellow paper on the podium. "In Robinson versus, The City Council. The court ruled that any ordinance which creates a prior restraint on speech must be narrowly tailored. It has to be specific. It cannot be vague. She looked up, locking eyes with the prosecutor. The current law says a group needs a permit if they are likely to cause a disturbance. But it doesn't define what a disturbance is. She paused to let that sink in. Does a disturbance mean loud music? Does it mean holding a sign? Does it mean wearing a t-shirt that the police chief doesn't like? The law doesn't say. And when a law is vague, the police get to decide what it means on the spot. That gives them too much power. It turns the police into judges, and that isn't how our system works. Man in the back row, wearing a mechanic's uniform with grease stains on the sleeves, leaned forward and whispered loudly to his wife, "She's right. That's exactly what they do." His wife nodded, her eyes glued to the girl at the front. The prosecutor stood up again. This time, he didn't look bored. He looked sweaty. He took a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped his forehead. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a little too high, "we can't rewrite the entire city code based on a technicality." The officer on the scene felt that the situation was escalating, that is reasonable suspicion. The teenager was blocking the sidewalk. Grace turned to him, and for the first time, she looked a little annoyed. It was a human reaction, a teenager annoyed that an adult wasn't listening. "I wasn't blocking the sidewalk," she said. "I was standing on the grass. And the video from the police car camera will show that." "I know, because I requested the footage this morning." The judge's head snapped up. "You requested the footage?" "Yes, sir," Grace said. "It's public record. The clerk gave it to me on a USB drive." She pulled a small silver drive out of her pocket and held it up. The light from the window caught the metal, making it glint. "The video shows the officer walking up to me. Not because I was loud, but because I was holding a banner. And across the park, there was a group of 50 people singing hymns. They were louder than I was. They were blocking the paved path. But the officer walked right past them to arrest me. Why? Because their banner said church picnic and mine said City Hall accountability." She let the question hang in the air. It was a powerful question. It was the kind of question that makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to look at their own biases. The judge looked at the prosecutor. "Do you have this footage?" he asked. The prosecutor looked down at his shoes. "No, Your Honor, I didn't think it was necessary." The judge sighed. It was a deep, heavy sigh that seemed to come from his toes. He looked tired, but he also looked angry. Not angry at the girl, but angry at the situation. He realized he had been sitting here, trusting the system, assuming that the police and the city lawyers were doing their jobs correctly. He had been ready to punish a kid without looking at the evidence himself. It made him feel sick to his stomach. Grace kept going. She was on a roll now, and she could feel the momentum. "Article 4, Section 12, which I mentioned earlier," she continued, pointing to her notes. "It specifically prohibits the government from playing favorites. The city gave the church group a free pass. They charged me $200 for a permit I didn't have time to get because the meeting was called yesterday. That is a content-based distinction. The Supreme Court has been very clear about this. You can't charge money for some speech and not for others." She picked up another paper. This one was a graph she had drawn by hand with colored markers. It looked like a school project, but the data on it was shocking. I looked at the permits issued over the last 5 years. Out of 200 permits denied, 180 were for political groups. Out of 300 permits waived, all of them were for religious or private corporate events. She held up the graph so the judge could see. The colorful bars were stark. It was a visual proof of unfairness that you couldn't argue with. "Your Honor, a law that only punishes people who disagree with the city government isn't a law. It's a weapon." The judge stared at the graph. He didn't need a lawyer to explain it to him. The numbers spoke for themselves. He took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He could feel the sweat on his own forehead now. The air conditioning in the room didn't seem to be working anymore. He looked at the girl. She was standing there, holding a hand-drawn graph in a courtroom full of expensive suits and degrees, and she was winning. She was dismantling years of precedent with nothing but a library card and a printer. It was the most American thing he had ever seen. The judge thought about his own daughter. She was about the same age. She was worried about prom dates and driver's tests. He tried to imagine her standing here doing this. He couldn't. It made him realize how special Grace was. This wasn't just about being smart. This was about guts. It took an incredible amount of courage to stand there alone, with the power of the state bearing down on her, and refuse to back down. The city is arguing, the prosecutor tried one last time. His voice weak, that the park closes at sunset for safety reasons. Dark parks are dangerous. Grace didn't miss a beat. Then close it for everyone, she said simply. If it's too dark for me to hold a sign, it's too dark for a choir to practice. But the city doesn't close it. They leave the lights on for the events they like. So it's not about safety. It's about control. She looked back at the judge, her expression softening. I know I am just a kid. I know I don't have a fancy office. But the law is the law. And the law says that the government works for us, not the other way around. When they write rules that treat us differently based on what we say, they break their own rules. The judge put his glasses back on. He looked down at the docket sheet where the word guilty was pre-printed next to her name. Waiting for him to check the box, he picked up his pen. But he didn't check the box. He looked at the statute book, then at the graph, then at the girl. The room was waiting. Every single person was holding their breath. The bailiff had stopped leaning against the door. He was standing straight up, his arms crossed, watching the judge's face. The reporters in the back row were typing furiously on their laptops, their fingers flying across the keys. They knew they were witnessing history. They knew this wasn't just a traffic court story anymore. The judge realized that this was the kind of case that ended up in textbooks. This was the kind of case that law students would read 50 years from now. And he was the one sitting in the chair. He had a choice. He could ignore the law, protect the system, and punish the girl to keep things moving smoothly. Or he could do his job. He could uphold the Constitution, even though it was messy. Even though it was embarrassing for the city. Even though it meant admitting that the teenager was right and the grown-ups were wrong. He looked at Grace. She had stopped talking. She had said everything she needed to say. She just stood there waiting. She wasn't nervous anymore. She was peaceful. She knew she had done the right thing. The judge cleared his throat. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He reached for his gavel, his hand hovering over the dark wood. He didn't bang it yet. He wanted to say something first. He wanted the room to understand the gravity of what was happening. He looked at the prosecutor, who was slumped in his chair, defeated. Then he looked at Grace, standing tall in her oversized blazer. Madam Clerk, the judge said, his voice shaking slightly, please mark these exhibits as evidence. He looked up at Grace, and for the first time there was no smile on his face, and there was no skepticism. There was only respect. I have heard enough. The silence that followed wasn't the same heavy, waiting silence from before. It was electric. It felt like the moment right after a lightning bolt strikes a tree. When the air is still crackling with energy, but nobody has moved yet. The judge took his hand away from the gavel and didn't pick it up. Instead, he leaned all the way forward on his elbows. His face just a few feet from Grace's. He wasn't looking at her as a defendant anymore, or even as a young girl. He was looking at her as an equal. For almost a minute, nobody spoke. The only sound was the rustle of the prosecutor shuffling through his papers, looking for anything that could fix the mess Grace had just made. But he found nothing. His shoulders dropped. He closed his file folder with a quiet thud. The judge looked down at the hand-drawn graph one more time. It was crude, made with markers and a ruler, but the lines were straight, and the numbers were undeniable. He looked at the yellowed paper from 1984. Then he looked at the city code that had been sitting on his desk for years. A book he had opened 1,000 times without ever really seeing the problem. It was humbling. It was the kind of humbling feeling that hurts a little bit, like swallowing a spoonful of bad medicine. He realized that he had been complacent. He had trusted that the laws were fair because they came from the city, but today, a teenager had shown him that trust was misplaced. Counsel, the judge said, looking over at the prosecutor. His voice was low and serious. Is the city prepared to argue that the 1998 exemption for religious gatherings does not create a content-based distinction? The prosecutor stood up slowly. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor. He buttoned his jacket, then unbuttoned it, his hands fumbling. He cleared his throat, but no words came out at first. He looked at the judge, then at Grace, then at the floor. "Your Honor," the prosecutor finally said, his voice lacking the confidence it had at the start, We were not aware of the discrepancy in the fee structure. We assumed the city attorney had reviewed the permits. It was a weak excuse. It was the kind of excuse you give when you know you've lost the argument. But you still have to say something. The judge didn't look impressed. "You are asking this court to enforce a law that you haven't even read? A law that, on its face, treats citizens differently based on their religious affiliations." The prosecutor swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. No, sir. We are not prepared to argue that. The logic presented by the defense is sound." A gasp went through the gallery. It wasn't a loud noise, just a collective intake of breath. The prosecutor had just admitted defeat. He had just said in front of everyone that the teenager was right. It was a stunning moment. In the legal world, people rarely admit they are wrong until a judge forces them to. But here, faced with the undeniable truth of the graph and the case law, he just folded. The judge turned his attention back to Grace. He saw the relief wash over her face, but he also saw that she was still standing tall. She hadn't won yet. The judge still had to make the ruling, but the fact that the other side had given up made her victory feel real. "Miss," the judge said. His tone was gentle now. He took off his glasses and set them down on the desk, rubbing his eyes. "I have been a judge for a very long time. I have seen lawyers from the biggest firms in the state come in here, with suits that cost more than most people's cars and briefcases full of complicated arguments, but I have never seen a case presented this clearly. You cut through the noise. You didn't talk about feelings. You talked about the Constitution." He paused, looking around the courtroom to make sure everyone was listening. "The First Amendment isn't there to protect popular speech. Popular speech doesn't need protection. Nobody is trying to shut down the church choir, as you pointed out. The First Amendment is there to protect the speech that people in power don't want to hear. It is there to protect the girl with the controversial sign. It is there to protect the minority view." He picked up the gavel. The wood felt heavy in his hand. He knew what he was about to do was going to cause a headache for the city. The newspapers would be calling. The mayor would be angry. But for the first time in a long time, the judge felt a spark of excitement about his job. He wasn't just processing paperwork anymore. He was doing justice. "I find that the current ordinance, as applied by the city, is unconstitutional," the judge stated clearly. His voice boomed through the room. "The exemption for religious gatherings, coupled with the high fees for political gatherings, creates a discriminatory burden on free speech. It violates the Equal Protection Clause of the state constitution." He paused for effect. "Therefore, the citation against the defendant is dismissed. With prejudice." The room erupted. It wasn't polite clapping like at a theater. It was a roar. People in the gallery stood up. The man in the mechanic's uniform whistled through his fingers. A woman in the back row started clapping so hard her hands turned red. The bailiff had to step forward and hold up his hands, shouting order, order in the court. But he was smiling while he did it. Grace stood at the podium, taking it all in. For a second, she looked overwhelmed. She looked down at her hands, and a shy smile crept onto her face. She wasn't the stern lawyer anymore. She was just a 17-year-old girl who couldn't believe she had actually done it. She looked up at the judge, her eyes shining, but the judge wasn't finished. He banged the gavel 3 times, loud and sharp, until the room quieted down again. He waited until everyone was seated and the noise had died down to a murmur. However, the judge continued, looking over his glasses at the city's lawyer. "This case brings up a larger issue. If this ordinance is unconstitutional, then everyone who has been fined under it for the last 10 years has been treated unfairly." The prosecutor's face went pale. He looked like he might be sick. "I am not just dismissing this case," the judge said. I am issuing an order to vacate the ordinance entirely, effective immediately. The city cannot enforce this law as written until it is rewritten to be fair to everyone, regardless of what they are saying or who they are praying to. This was even bigger than dismissing the ticket. This was a court order telling the city government to stop doing what they were doing. It was a legal bomb. It meant that the city council would have to go back to the drawing board. It meant that the police department would have to change how they handled protests. It was a massive shift in power. And it all started because a teenager refused to pay a fine. I am also ordering the city clerk to notify everyone who has paid a fine under this statute in the last 5 years. The judge added, they may be entitled to a refund. A cheer went up from the back of the room again. The reporter who had been typing furiously stopped and just stared at the judge, his mouth open. He knew he had the lead story for the evening news. This wasn't just local gossip. This was national news material. The judge looked back at Grace. Young lady, he said, I don't know if you want to go to law school, but if you don't, you are wasting a God-given talent. You saw the truth when everyone else saw a routine procedure. That is a rare gift. Grace blushed bright red. She gathered her papers, stacking them neatly on the podium. Thank you, Your Honor, she said softly. I just wanted them to listen. They heard you today. Believe me, the whole city heard you today. He banged the gavel one final time. Case is adjourned. Grace turned around and walked back down the center aisle. This time she wasn't walking with her head down. She walked with her shoulders back. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. People reached out to pat her on the back as she passed. Some wanted to shake her hand. An older woman, who looked like she had been coming to this courthouse for years, reached out and squeezed Grace's arm. Good job, honey, she whispered. You did us proud, as Grace reached the double doors at the back of the room. She paused for a second and looked back. She looked at the judge. He was still sitting on the bench, watching her go. He gave her a small, solemn nod. He didn't smile. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was a moment of shared understanding between two people who respected the law. Even when the people who wrote it got it wrong. Then she pushed the doors open and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind her, but the feeling she left in the room remained. It was a feeling of hope, a reminder that the system wasn't perfect, but it was built to be corrected by people brave enough to stand up and speak the truth. Inside, the judge sat there for a long time after the room had emptied. He looked at the empty podium where the girl had stood. He looked at the graph with the colorful markers still taped to his bench. He thought about the years he had spent on the bench, the thousands of cases he had heard. Most of them had faded from his memory, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would never forget this day. He would never forget the girl in the oversized blazer who taught him that sometimes. The most important voice in the room is the one that comes from the smallest person. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom clicked shut, but the noise inside didn't just stop, it exploded. The moment Grace was out of the room, the people in the gallery stopped holding their breath. The man in the mechanic's uniform stood up and clapped his hands together once, loud and sharp, like he was celebrating a touchdown. A reporter near the back was already on her phone, speaking quickly into the receiver, her eyes wide with excitement. Even the bailiff, who usually looked like he was carved out of stone, was shaking his head and chuckling as he gathered his files. Inside the well of the court, the judge sat alone on the bench. The adrenaline of the moment was starting to fade, replaced by a heavy, thoughtful quiet. He looked down at the wooden block where his gavel rested. It felt heavier now. He looked at the empty spot where the girl had been standing. The oversized blazer, the nervous hands, the trembling voice that had turned into steel, it all felt like a dream. But the papers scattered across his desk were real. The graph with the colored markers was real. The order he had just signed was very real. He let out a long breath that he felt like he'd been holding in for weeks. For 30 years he had sat in this chair. He had seen thousands of faces. Some were angry, some were crying, some were bored. But he couldn't remember the last time he had seen someone look so. Fearless, it wasn't that she wasn't scared. He knew she was terrified. It was that she did the right thing anyway. That was a kind of bravery the judge rarely saw, and certainly not from the high-priced lawyers who, argued about technicalities for hours. The judge picked up the hand-drawn graph again. He looked at the bright red and blue lines. It was such a simple thing, just a piece of paper and some markers. But it had brought down a law that had been on the books for 20 years. It made him wonder how many other laws were like that sitting there, accepted by everyone, just waiting for someone brave enough to question them. He felt a strange mix of pride and shame. Pride that the system worked, that the truth had won out. Shame that it took a 17-year-old girl to point out what the grown-up should have seen a long time ago. He thought about his own kids. He wondered if he had taught them to stand up for what was right, even when it was scary. He hoped so. He hoped that if they were ever in a situation like Grace's, they would have even a fraction of her courage. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. The city noises, horns honking, sirens wailing, people talking swirled around the front steps. Grace walked out of the building and squinted in the light. She felt lighter, like she had been carrying a backpack full of rocks and suddenly dropped it. Her hands were still shaking a little bit. But it was the kind of shaking you get after a really fast roller coaster ride, a mix of fear and excitement. A few reporters were waiting on the steps, microphones in hand. "Grace, Grace, do you have a comment?" One of them shouted. She stopped for a second. She wasn't used to attention like this. She looked at the cameras, then at the reporter. She didn't have a prepared speech. She didn't have a PR team telling her what to say. So she just said what she felt. "I just wanted them to listen," she said into the microphone. "I think the laws should work for everyone, not just the people with money or the people who know the right people. I'm just glad it's over." She gave a small, shy wave and hurried down the steps. She didn't want to be a celebrity. She just wanted to go home. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for the city, but a quiet one for Grace. The story of the teen who took down City Hall spread like wildfire. It was on the news, in the newspapers, and all over the internet. People called her a hero. The local law school even invited her to come speak to a class, which she thought was hilarious. But Grace stayed mostly in the background. She went back to school. She did her homework. She hung out with her friends, but the impact of what she did rippled out through the city like a stone thrown into a pond. The city council was in a panic. They had emergency meetings. They hired high-priced lawyers from the Capitol to fix the mess. They couldn't ignore the judge's order. They had to rewrite the ordinance. They had to make it fair. They got rid of the insurance fees that were too high. They got rid of the exemptions for religious groups that political groups didn't get. They made the rules clear, and it wasn't just about the parks. The police department changed how they trained new officers. They started teaching them about the Constitution, not just about how to write tickets. The city hall clerks stopped looking at people with suspicion when they asked for a permit. The whole culture of the city shifted just a little bit toward fairness. It was a slow change, but it was real. The biggest change was the refunds. The judge had ordered it, and the city had to pay up. Hundreds of people who had been fined unfairly over the years received checks in the mail. It wasn't a fortune of money, but to the single mothers, the students, and the retired folks who received them, it was a victory. It was proof that the system could make a mistake and then fix it. One afternoon, about a month after the trial, the judge was walking through the park near the courthouse. It was a Saturday, and the park was full of people. He saw a group of older ladies doing yoga on the grass. He saw a family having a birthday party. And then he saw something that made him smile. Near the walking path, a small group of teenagers had set up a table. They had signs that said, "Save the library," and more books. They were passing out flyers to people walking by. A police car drove by slowly. The officer didn't stop. He didn't tell them to move. He didn't ask for a permit. He just waved at the kids and kept driving. The judge walked over to the group. He wasn't wearing his robe. He was just wearing a baseball cap and a jacket, so nobody recognized him as the judge. He stood there for a moment, watching the kids. They were loud. They were enthusiastic. They were exercising their rights. He saw a girl in a familiar, oversized blazer sitting at the table, stapling flyers together. It was Grace. She looked happy. She looked like she belonged there. She was arguing with a boy about what font to use on the sign. Laughing as they debated between Ariel and Comic Sans, the judge walked up to the table. Grace looked up, ready to hand him a flyer. Her eyes went wide when she saw who it was. "Your Honor," she said, standing up quickly, knocking over a stack of papers. Hello." The judge smiled and held up a hand. "Relax, Grace. I'm off the clock. Just enjoying the park." He looked around at the signs. "Save the library, huh? That sounds like a good cause." "It is," Grace said, regaining her composure. "They want to cut the budget. We think that's wrong." "Well," the judge said, looking at the permitless table and the unfined teenagers, "it looks like you're allowed to be here. I think the new law is working pretty well." Grace smiled. It was a genuine bright smile that reached her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "It is. It's better." The judge nodded. He looked at the girl who had caused him so much trouble and so much pride. "You know," he said softly, "I've been a judge for a long time. I thought I knew everything about the law, but you taught me something. You taught me that the law isn't just words in a book. It's people. It's standing up for what is right, even when you're small." "Thank you for that lesson." Grace blushed. She looked down at her shoes. "I just wanted to fix it," she muttered. "And you did," the judge said. "Don't ever lose that spirit, Grace. The world needs more people who are willing to ask why." He turned and started to walk away, back toward the courthouse that dominated the skyline. He walked a little slower than before. He felt older, but he also felt lighter. He knew he would retire soon. He was ready to pass the gavel to someone else. But he wasn't worried. As he walked away, he heard Grace's voice behind him, loud and clear, explaining her cause to a passerby. He smiled to himself. History wasn't just written in old books by dead presidents. Sometimes history was written by a teenager in a blazer, standing in a park, asking for fairness. And as the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the grass where the children played and the citizens spoke freely, the judge knew that the future was in good hands.